Welcome to part two of the lecture on civil rights. In this section, we'll talk about the women's equality movement in addition to other equality movements in American politics. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the second part of the lecture on civil rights. We're going to start by talking about the women's rights movement. Women were disenfranchised for many years in the United States, and the women's rights movement really began with the Seneca Falls Convention, which was a convention in 1848 to advance the rights of women. It was organized by two prominent women's rights activists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The outcome of the convention was a Declaration of Sentiments, which was a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence, but the point was gender equality. And one of the things that was articulated in the Declaration of Sentiments was the then radical demand to give women the right to vote. And that was known as suffrage. And so the Seneca Falls Convention is really the emergence of a true formalized suffrage movement. And this kind of first phase of the women's rights movement is often called the first wave of the feminist movement, and its goals were gender equality in politics. Women were not granted voting rights nationally until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Before 1920, women, had been active in public activities for at least 70 years, going back at least to the Seneca Falls Convention. After the Seneca Falls Convention, they played leading roles in the abolitionist movement and the temperance movement, which was the movement to ban the sale of alcohol. Before women were granted the right to vote nationally, they did often see some more progress at the state level, especially in the West. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1890, then Colorado and Utah and Idaho, and eventually California by 1911 had established the right to vote for women. The second wave of the feminist movement was in the 1960s and 70s, and they were seeking to build upon the progress of the first wave. And so the second wave was all about economic and social equality. And the chief goal was to add an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. Once this resolution is introduced, there is a lot of momentum and it passes Congress, but they get to 35 states out of the 38 needed, and then they run into some roadblocks, and there's this kind of last minute opposition that stops the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment in the original resolution had an expiration date, which was extended a few times, but eventually was not renewed in the early 80s. Since then, however, actually recently, in the last few years, 3 states have ratified the ERA. But now we have some questions because in the original resolution, there was an expiration date. At this point, we're past it. And now there are other states that originally did ratify the ERA, but now they want to revoke their previous support. So there's some questions over what will happen with the ERA, at least as of 2020. Despite the failure of the ERA in the 1970s, women did win some victories. First of all, it became easier to file and win suits on the basis of gender discrimination. There were um, some legislative achievements that happened in the early 1970s, including Title IX of the 1972 Education Act, which prohibited gender discrimination in education. And that led to, kind of most prominently, the rise of women's sports at the collegiate level. And also by the 1990s, it was invoked to open up military academies to women enrolling. Some other progress, sexual harassment is now recognized by the court system. There are two forms of sexual harassment: quid pro quo harassment, which is an explicit or strongly implied threat that submitting to the harassment is a condition for employment. And then there's hostile work environment harassment, in which there's just toxic, offensive, intimidating employment conditions. And side note, both men and women, and people who identify as non-binary, anybody can experience sexual harassment, but overwhelmingly, historically, women have kind of been the primary victims. So that's why it's included in this section of the lecture as part of the women's rights movement. And then equality in employment. Women have long fought for civil rights in employment and to achieve equal pay. Women have experienced pay discrimination for a long time in history. And in 1963, the Equal Pay Act made pay discrimination illegal, but pay discrimination did remain. In fact, is still an issue today. In 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act gave women expanded rights to sue in cases in which they alleged that there was pay discrimination. Even today, women's pay is still not equal to men's pay. The gap has been reduced, but there are still challenges. For instance, studies show that women who ask for raises and promotions tend to receive them at a lower rate than women who do not request them. Moving on to other equality movements, Latinos are another group that have experienced discrimination and have a history of activism, including the creation of the League of United Latin American Citizens, which was founded in 1929. They've used legal strategies to fight discrimination. One of the more prominent court cases involving Latinos actually happened here in California in 1947, the court case of Mendez versus Westminster, which ended school segregation in Orange County and actually all of California, really. It was actually a pretty important case because the attorneys that were acting on behalf of the Mendez family, the family that wanted their daughter to be able to go to school, tried out some legal strategies that they would then use in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Another significant aspect of the Latino civil rights movement was the mobilization of farm workers by Cesar Chavez. The goal of UFM was to improve working conditions for farm workers. Most workers, especially in California, were Mexican and Filipino migrants who were poorly paid. They did not get adequate breaks, were forced to work really long hours. And Cesar Chavez's tactics helped raise awareness to these issues. He would lead strikes, boycotts, participate in hunger strikes, and he was also a very inspirational speaker. Immigration is another issue that's commonly affiliated with Latino civil rights. The Supreme Court has ruled that unauthorized immigrants are eligible for education and emergency medical care, but they can be denied other services. And then in recent years, another significant issue is the question about how Congress should address the situation with dreamers. And dreamers are the children of undocumented immigrants, children who were brought to the United States when they were very young and never achieved legal status. And under President Obama, the government issued an executive order known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals that granted quasi legal status to those millions of people who had entered the United States illegally as children without documentation. And now, under DACA, they're able to get work, they're able to go to school, but it is something, because it was an executive order, it has not been something that Congress has addressed through legislation. It's not quite as permanent as it would be with a law passed at the federal level. Asian Americans are another group that have also fought for civil rights, especially starting with Chinese immigrants who came to California in the 1850s to work in the gold fields and on the railroads. They faced significant hardship, significant discrimination, especially when it came to laws passed at the federal level to try to restrict their eligibility for citizenship, and also laws that sought to prevent Chinese immigrants from even coming into the United States, most famously with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And that was the start of a period in time in the United States in which Congress passed quite a lot of restrictive immigration laws all the way up through the 1920s. Japanese Americans have also faced discrimination, quite notoriously and tragically, with internment camps during World War II when 120 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated from their homes. Um, the conditions in these camps were, quite poor. They were not closed until 1944, although they were challenged in court. by a Japanese American man named Fred Korematsu. The Supreme Court ruled in Korematsu's case that actually these camps were militarily necessary and not racially motivated, although we now know that otherwise. The case is never formally overturned, unfortunately, which means it's still on the books. There have been federal task forces that have sought to kind of rectify the wrong that was perpetrated in the 1940s. There have been attempts at reparations. There have been acknowledgments that a terrible, tragic incident of discrimination, and that it was, quote, grave injustice, end quote, in sending them to the internment camps. But without the Supreme Court formally overruling that case, the chapter is still kind of an open one. Native Americans are another group that have experienced significant discrimination and racism and hardship. They have a unique status in that they're both American citizens and members of sovereign tribal nations. They actually were not considered U.S. citizens until 1924. In the 1960s, along with other groups who were advocating for civil rights, they began to use protests and litigation and assertion of tribal rights to try to improve their situation and achieve civil rights. 1968 was a significant victory when the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed, and this extended the Bill of Rights to Native people for the first time. And then in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act gave Americans more control over their own land. And then in 1987, the Supreme Court freed Native Americans from state regulations prohibiting gambling, which provided more economic opportunities for Native Americans. Disabled Americans also have experienced the fight for civil rights. The Federal Rehabilitation Act outlawed discrimination against individuals with disabilities, and that progress was really dramatically expanded by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which guaranteed equal employment rights and access to public businesses and prohibited discrimination in housing, employment, and healthcare. LGBTQ Americans is one of the largest civil rights movements in contemporary America, and it began in 1969 with the Stonewall riot at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, New York City. In the history of LGBTQ civil rights, a significant development was the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which began in the 1990s. And essentially, this is where the federal government told LGBTQ Americans that they could serve in the military if they were not open about their sexual orientation or did not partake in same-sex relationships. That was repealed in 2011 under the Obama administration. Other important advancements include Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, in which the Supreme Court struck down a Texas statute criminalizing certain intimate sexual conduct between consenting partners of the same sex. And then same-sex marriage was legalized by Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, in which the court invoked the 14th Amendment. One of the most significant outcomes of the civil rights era was the policy of affirmative action, which was government policies and programs to seek redress for past injustices against specified groups. And under affirmative action, policies, programs make special efforts to provide members of these groups with access to educational and employment opportunities. So, for instance, trying to open up college enrollment to more people of color. Affirmative action was a outcome of the civil rights era of the 60s in that it really didn't become a prominent goal of the national government until the 1970s, and it immediately did face significant legal challenges. One of the most significant cases involving the Regents of the University of California in 1978. Affirmative action was actually upheld in that case. But what's interesting is that California has since then eliminated affirmative action at the state level when voters approved Proposition 209 in 1996. This is the end of part 2 of the lecture on civil rights. In the final part, we will take a closer look at the book, The Color of Law. Thanks for listening.